everyone. Thank you all for joining us for episode 2 of the Public Power Hour. Our topic for this show is rent and utilities strike. My name is Jen Jantanapichier, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the New York City DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group, and I live in North Brooklyn, where I am part of the local chapter. Tonight, I'm joined by my co-host, Daniel Goulden. Daniel, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Daniel, use they, them pronouns. I am also on the Eco-Socialist Working Group. I'm a member, and I'm located in Central Brooklyn, and I'm active in the local branch there too.
Awesome, thanks. So the Public Power Hour is a new bi-weekly live stream show produced by the New York City Eco-Socialist Working Group. We just want to let you all know that this will be recorded and streamed onto our Eco-Socialist Facebook page. On the Public Power Hour, we draw connections on how the climate movement is ultimately connected to so many other issues. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how housing issues intersect with climate issues, and ultimately how rent relief needs to be paired with utilities relief. We are really excited to be talking with Marcela Mitaynes, a Democratic Socialist running for New York State Assembly, Sumathy Kumar and Fabian Rogers, housing organizers from U.H.O.P.E and H.O.P.E, and Sia Weaver, the organizing coordinator for Housing Justice for All. Just to give you a sense of the flow for the evening, Daniel and I will be asking our guests some questions about our statewide rent and utility strike. We will then open it up to a Q&A session for those of you tuning in. So at any point during the episode that you have any questions for our guests, please drop them in the chat and we'll be collecting questions throughout the show. There's also a Q&A section that you can use. After the episode, we'll be providing a brief presentation for those of you who are interested in learning more about our public power campaign or how you can get plugged into the work. We hope you stay on the call and join us for that portion as well. That portion will be about 30 minutes total. So welcome, Marcela, Sumathy, Fabian, and Sia. Thank you all so much for joining us. Perhaps we can start with each of you briefly introducing yourselves, and then we can dive into some of the questions that we have for you all. I'm seeing Fabian showing up on my screen first. Fabian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, that's fine. Hi all, my name is Fabian Rogers. I'm a tenant that lives in near Brownsville, Brooklyn. I don't know what geo-directional thing that is, but I live near Brownsville, Brooklyn. Thomas Boylan, lived here for about 15 years. So yeah, glad to be a part of this. And I'm also a member of H.O.P.E with Sumathy Kumar. She invited me along to this, so glad to be a part of this conversation. Thanks for bringing me along.
Thanks so much, Fabian. Maybe Sumathy.
Hi everyone, I'm Sumathy. I'm a tenant organizer with U.H.O.P.E and H.O.P.E, housing organizers for people empowerment, which is a tenant group in Brownsville that Fabian is a part of. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the New York City DSA chapter.
Thanks, Sumathy. Hi, Marcela. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcela Mitaynes. I'm a long-term resident of Sunset Park. Through my own displacement pressures, became involved in the tenant movement, helping to organize, really getting involved in civic engagement in my community, and really understanding the need to have representation that understands the working class. And so I'm also running for state assembly at the 51st Assembly District.
Sia. Hi, Sia.
Hey, everybody. My name is Sia. I am a member of the Central Brooklyn branch of NYC DSA, and I'm on the Housing Working Group Organizing Committee. And I also am the campaign coordinator of a coalition called Housing Justice for All, which is a coalition of over 70 organizations that represent tenants and homeless New Yorkers that is fighting to end homelessness and strengthen tenants' rights in New York. And Marcela and H.O.P.E are both a part of that coalition outside of the other amazing work that they are doing as the DSA.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I think we're just going to dive right into our questions. So, you know, there has been, ever since the COVID-19 crisis began, we've had really historic levels of unemployment, Great Depression levels of unemployment. A lot of people are really wondering, are really unable to pay their bills. So, Housing Justice for All has done really amazing work organizing for a rent strike. Kind of the tagline is "Can't Pay May," which is awesome. So I guess my first question is really just for everyone. I want to know, what is going to happen on May 1st? What are you organizing for? What does that day look like? It's in 5 days. What's that going to look like?
I wish I knew. So, I mean, I can say a little bit about what's happening so far. So far, there are 57 buildings in New York representing about 2,000 units that are going on a rent strike on May 1st. Another 20 buildings are in the pipeline and could go on a rent strike on June 1st. And so that is really over, well over 2,000 units of 2,000 families who will not be paying rent on May 1st. And then in addition to that, we've got almost 9,000 people who are individuals living in buildings who maybe their building isn't organizing, but they've also committed to not pay rent on May 1st. Not because, not just in solidarity with rent strikers, but because they really can't pay it. So those are just the people who've committed to not pay rent in collective action. We know that there is millions more who aren't paying rent alone. We invite them to join our movement by signing our pledge to cancel rent. I can give the link or whatever. But yeah, I mean, this is the largest rent strike in at least 100 years in New York. And I, don't know what it's going to be like. Every day is different.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to?
I think what we do know is that folks are not going to pay the rent, and it's really because they can't. They're in a tough situation. This is unprecedented, and it's not that folks don't want to pay. They just can't. Before this epidemic, folks were living paycheck to paycheck with 2 and 3 jobs. And, understanding also that rent strikes have been around, like we've heard, for a really long time. It's a strategic part of a larger organizing plan that you do with tenants. Whether we are calling the rent strike or not, like, it's happening. It's happening in masses just because folks can't afford it.
Sumathy and Fabian, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that Marcela and Sia covered it, but I think, we don't know what it's going to look like on May 1st, but in most of our lifetimes, I don't think we've seen this level of tenant organizing and cohesion across all tenants across the state. And so it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's definitely really exciting. I agree. Marcela, you brought up a really good point that before coronavirus, tenants were already in a housing crisis. And, over 50% of tenants were rent burdened, which means that you pay 30% or more of your income on rent. And a third of that were severely rent burdened, meaning that they pay 50% or more of income on rent. And so now we have high rents, but millions of us have lost our incomes, and millions, like you said, can't pay May. It's not that they don't want to, it's just that they simply can't. I was wondering if, Marcela, you and Sia could maybe talk about the strategy behind the rent strike. What are some of the goals, and how do you aim to win?
Yeah, I could start a little bit. In a perfect world, you would be able to negotiate with the landlord and possibly come to an agreement on something lower to pay, at least through this time, or just even, the truth is folks just don't have the money to pay. And so we're already hearing harassment with tenants being told that the rent is due on the 1st, that they can just go ahead and pay with their credit card. If they can't pay the rent, they should just leave. we need to understand that this has gotten to the point where it's just profiteering. And at a point or at a time where we are seeing, you know, so much chaos, it really is, it seems unethical to just not do anything. And so this is really creating unprecedented government intervention in the real estate market. And part of it is we are using our lived experiences to really outline what that should look like and what kind of relief that should be. This is a city and state of renters, and really the folks in charge aren't really discussing what relief would look like. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that I agree with. There's really two tracks to the rent strike, and I'll just lay them out a little bit. So the first track is a more traditional rent strike tack. And so that is tenants coming together in their building to demand that rent is canceled directly from their landlord. And that's happening in, like I said, 57 buildings across New York State. And big landlords, big buildings with big landlords, small landlords, and we are calling directly on the landlord to cancel the rent there. And then in addition to that, we have this sort of mass non-compliance track where thousands and thousands of renters are coming with us to put political pressure to take the fact that they are alone in their inability to pay rent and to step into their power and to say, I can't pay rent, but I'm not alone, and I'm going to call on Governor Cuomo to do something about it. So the target of the rent strike is really the state government, and we are demanding that they take action. So what's the strategy? I mean, the strategy here is that, like Marcela said, we are at a place where like winning, Cuomo has to do something about the rent. Winning is basically impossible. The question is, what is this government intervention going to look like, and how are we going to impact and affect it? And our thinking here is that, you know, rent can be canceled in a totally chaotic way by us, or rent can be canceled in a predictable way that's managed by the state. And it's actually better for the real estate industry and for us if the state intervenes. So we are trying to heighten that chaos to the point where Governor Cuomo wants to take action. Right now, he does not.
Yeah, this is something I think about all the time. I mean, I just try to, you know, think about when I hear the numbers of unemployed people, when I hear the numbers of people who can't pay rent. It was like 30% in April. It's going to be even higher in May. You know, when you look at just the fact that, like, you know, reopening, we're not going to be back to January, you know, next week. It's going to be a really slow process to come back. I guess to me, it's really shocking that we're not even putting these measures in place. Like, I guess my thoughts are like, you know, you say that something has to be done. You know, what are kind of the various scenarios here, you know, going from like, you know, the government doesn't care at all about tenants to something where, like, you know, the government really is paying attention to tenants, and like Cuomo really, you know, is forced to do something.
Well, there's like 6 bills before the state legislature right now that do a variety of things, and some of them bail out the real estate industry, some of them extend the eviction moratorium. There are lots of different things in ways that the state could intervene. The state could intervene to protect the profits of real estate. The state could intervene to keep tenants housed. Our demand is that the burden is not on renters to prove that they lost income. Our demand is that any burden of proof fall on the real estate industry to show that they've lost income if they need to get state subsidy. We understand that, you know, we understand that there is a great degree of money that is involved, and we do want like, as an end goal of all of this, to expand our stock of like deeply affordable and socially controlled housing. But we don't want subsidy to come into like landlords' pockets without any conditions, right? So we want any subsidy that comes in to outlast this crisis and to lead to like a transition to social housing.
That would be amazing. Sounds
It
great.
means testing for landlords. I love it.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Like that.
Marcela and Sia. So my next question is for Sumathy and Fabian. You have and H.O.P.E has been doing really amazing work building with tenants directly on the public power campaign specifically. I believe I saw both of you at the Flatbush Town Hall on public power just a few months ago. Can you talk a little bit more about how utilities fit into this picture of a rent strike?
Yeah, just from what I remember of the Flatbush Town Hall, what I said there, where utilities falls in this picture was just before COVID-19 had impacted New York the way it did. Utilities was another issue on the board, just like it is in terms of the housing crisis, in terms of people being able to maintain housing and living. Utility bills more specifically, were just as much of a problem just because it's such a monopoly esque market. Just because when you're talking about the energy grid, there can only be one energy grid at a time. And the problem right now that we have is it's not a publicly owned sort of interface or resource overall. It's a privately owned resource handled by Con Ed as well as a few other companies that I can't get off the top of my head because it's been a while. I apologize. But the issue becomes in the fact that this market is such a monopoly, it affects the prices in which renters have to pay in order to get the resources that they want month by month. So what does that mean? That means the rate that you pay for utility can potentially be a second rent bill that you're paying instead of just simply a tax or a simple just fee out of your pocket. So on top of the ongoing housing crisis and the fact that folks are struggling with market share rent overall, or even dealing with the stigmas of rent stabilized housing or anything like that, you compound that with the problem that utility bills can be just as problematic in rate and scale, and now you have a recipe for disaster that is a burden for renters to have to deal with, instead of real estate owners or landlords thinking about what that relationship with power looks like. So the public power campaign is just the idea of democratizing, decommodifying, and decarbonizing the power sources that we see and we use every day, from the electricity to the oil, just those types of energies. First, cleaning it, cleaning where those resources coming from, because there could be better alternative resources where we could get that energy from, as well as removing the power, the changing the shift of power from privately owned companies to a public governmental entity, a governmental enterprise that has full control over what utilities looks like, and that would give a better and more fair picture of what renters should have to pay for in the future. And this is more just an ideal sort of imaging, but I think it's really a feasible idea if just people besides renters have that in mind. So this then becomes another conversation that involves Cuomo, other state legislators of that matter as well, who have to think about the tenants first, be more people oriented rather than landlord oriented and real estate oriented, and worrying about what the stocks on how are they affected in these troublesome times, but also think about the people and what their state of mind, how they're being affected, how the state of their money, how the state of their pockets are looking at this time. Just worrying about that. So I apologize for the tangent, but yeah, I think utilities falls right into this picture just because it's a secondary payment that a lot of us worry about, and it kind of falls to the back burner just because you already have rent to deal with, and you don't want to. And a lot of us are in a position where we're juggling which bill to pay, and for things that are essential resources that we need for every day, I don't think it should be a juggling of essential resources. And that's essentially what public power is aiming at, to avoid that sort of problem moving forward, if we can get to that, if that makes sense.
That was a fantastic answer. Always feel free to go on a tangent. I guess a follow-up question to that I had was, I have kind of seen from, folks I'm friends with on Facebook groups I'm in, situations where people were not able to pay April rent because of COVID, and landlords shut down power, they shut off heat, something like that. Big reason we are fighting for public power is because we want to make sure, your utilities are in your hands, not in the hands of landlords. Is that something you've been seeing as a tenant organizer?
I've heard those types of that type of harassment that does happen. It depends on the complex and the jurisdiction of housing. Rent stabilized tenants might live a whole different reality, just because there are different governmental enterprises that might be involved in the jurisdiction of housing. So it really depends on the living situation. But petty things like that definitely can happen, just because there's just a lack of attention for tenants as opposed to the attention for landlords. And we really haven't gotten to that point where there's a lot of attention on landlord harassment, unless it's a very almost like a blasphemous case of landlord versus tenant. And it shouldn't have to be that way. It should be something better. And I think, again, that's what public power is aiming at, to avoid that scenario of extremism, in order for there to be governmental intervention in your everyday resources that you need, and you're having an issue with your landlord about overall. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess leading up to coronavirus, I kind of have a follow-up question for either Fabian or Sumathy. Just, what was the on-the-ground organizing around public power looking like, and how were you building power around public power?
Yeah, so we were doing a lot of canvases in the neighborhood in Brownsville, and talking to people about, Con Ed bills and the recent rate hike that Con Ed passed and got approval for. And people were angry and didn't like it. Hope recently endorsed the public power campaign, I think in February. And it was really exciting, I think, because, historically we've worked just on housing, more traditional housing campaigns. But we were starting to see the connections between utilities, climate justice, and housing in a way that was really powerful. And so I'm really excited now that Housing Justice for All and the Public Power Campaign are all working together, because I feel like it's the place where, our movement is trying to go. But yeah, Fabian, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Not that, I think you covered how our outreach efforts have been. It's really just been a lot of trial and error, just finding where other people relate to the public power campaigns, just like the Flatbush Town Hall, and just finding things like that, and Sumathy keeping the participants like myself informed, and just wanting to see if we're interested. It's just been a lot of trial and error to see what the people have been interested in, and that's how we got here. So. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I'm really excited by the collaboration between Housing Justice for All and the Public Power Campaign as well. I do think
I am
that,
too.
yeah, it just, in my own experience, being home all day, I'm using so much electricity, and I'm really kind of worried about what my utility bill is going to look like. So I guess just to switch gears a little bit, I've been organizing a little bit with my neighbors in my own building. Many of us have lost our incomes, yet I'm finding that people are still really concerned about actual consequences of not paying rent. They're really worried about not being able to renew their leases and about creating tensions with our landlord. In my own experience, it has been kind of hard and tricky to convince my neighbors why a rent strike is really critical to develop political pressure. A rent strike is a really bold move and something that's really scary in general for a lot of people to ponder. what would you say to someone who supports your goals but is really nervous about taking that step? And that can be open to anyone.
Marcela, do you want to answer that question? You're on mute.
You're on mute, Marcela.
Hello?
Hey.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to understand that there needs to be an open and honest conversation and education piece about what going on a rent strike entitles, and that sometimes takes a little bit of time. But it's also the idea and the understanding that as individuals, we have power. And in this instant, the rent money is actually a type of power that we can use, right? This is something that the landlord wants. And maybe, you know, he's not willing to talk about trying to figure out an understanding, but he's gonna want his money. And so that in and of itself is power that the tenants can wield to at least bring him to start a negotiation, right? As to right now, we are hearing about harassments, and, you know, landlords want their money. And real estate was thought to have been a form of investment, right? So when you invest, you're gambling. You know, sometimes you win or sometimes you might lose. And so understanding also that, you know, there's this guilt or this moral feeling sometimes tenants have about, well, I'm living here, I have to pay the rent, right? But that's also like a one-sided view, or I should say it's not reciprocated, right? The landlord isn't thinking, oh, you know, she's at a rent, she can't pay money, or just the everyday issues that tenants are dealing with, the fact that they do pay rent and they don't get any services, any maintenance or any repairs. And it's important to understand that it's a double-digit employment crisis that is actually causing this crisis for the real estate industry, and it's not tenants. But it's hard to have those conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is, and like what Marcela said is absolutely right. And there's a lot of people who are experienced tenant organizers on this call. I will tell you that in 10 years of tenant organizing in New York City, before 3 weeks ago, I had organized 2 rent strikes. And today, I mean, I'm not organizing any rent strikes directly, but I'm working with people across the state to organize a lot. And so I think that it's just really important to like underscore that the historical moment that we're in. And so that's like the first thing. And then the second thing is like, yeah, rent strikes are scary. There's a need to be real about the risk, but there's also a need to be real about the choices that people are making. And so to just, you know, point out some of the things that Fabian said around, you know, do I pay for healthcare? Do I pay for groceries? Do I pay for utilities? Or do I pay for rent? Like, if you're facing that choice right now, folks should know that there is an eviction moratorium. Housing courts are closed. And if you can't pay on May 1st, nothing is going to happen to you on May 2nd. Nothing's going to happen to you on May 15th either. Nothing's going to happen to you on June 1st. And so, like, if you can't pay now, or you can pay now, but you're afraid of paying later, if you're choosing between healthcare in a pandemic and rent, if you're choosing between food in a pandemic and rent, you should get healthcare and food. And the last thing I'll say is, like, if you can't pay, there's a lot of like embedded shame we have in that, but you're not alone. There are millions of people like you in this moment, right? And so, like, the point of the rent strike or the mass noncompliance action is that we are pushing out of that shame and into like political action together. And people should, yes, should feel afraid. Like, I'm afraid. I'm very afraid. But nothing that we've ever won has not been scary. If it wasn't scary, we wouldn't be pushing in the way that we need to be pushing. So yes, it's scary, but it's scarier to be by yourself. It's more powerful to be in action with your neighbors, and it's not your fault that you can't pay. It's just not.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I would say.
Wow, thank you. That was beautiful, Sia. Thank you. I guess you said that you had organized before this. You had organized 2 rent strikes. Now you're organizing dozens. I've noticed that in my friends who aren't necessarily as politically plugged in as me. People who just like don't really pay much attention to politics, have pretty mainline political beliefs. I talk to them on the phone and like, yeah, they're ready for a rent strike because like this crisis has really just shown. And I always try to take it a step further because they're my friends, and I'm we have conversations about how like, yeah, landlords aren't really great. Like, why are you paying someone a ridiculous amount of money every month and like they don't fix any appliances? Maybe the system isn't great. So there really is that potential for people to re-examine the system. I guess a question I have, and this is open to everyone, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it. It is kind of like but I do wonder like how widespread is the damage from this going to be? Because like if we really are at a point where 50% of people aren't paying, then like landlords are going to go broke. I mean, like, is this going to be a thing where landlords are kind of able to survive, or are we going to be seeing like large amounts of kind of real estate industries going bankrupt? And if that's the case, kind of how do we respond to that? As organizers, as democratic socialists, as people who are very invested in housing.
Sumathy, you want to answer? You look like
That's
you're
a lot.
I don't mind talking a bit. There's this interesting thought in my head that popped this. At one end, I think it really comes down to the thought of people's well-being. I think what makes this pandemic interesting is that the one thing that leads to more peril is more human interaction, close people being close to one another, and the way to avoid that is social distancing, staying at home, things like that. So in the case that the numbers start to increase in terms of economic fallout, I think that's an interesting discussion that the legislators and those who are in favor of money and economics rather than they are well-being, they have to explain themselves when it comes to the fact of, okay, so you're going to kick out whomever can't pay, but that comes at the expense of possible lives being taken from your callousness. And now you have a vacant home, people evicted, and now they're at peril health-wise. Like, this isn't as simple as like the stock market crashed. It crashed because there's a lack of activity within the work front, because going to work and being a regular everyday person is a danger at this point in time. So I think there might be an interesting conversation at the very least that'll happen in the future if there's more economic fallout that comes from this. And the folks that don't want to be well-being oriented first and people oriented first, they have to explain themselves to the general public, like the national public, as to why you don't care for people enough to allow them to stay within homes to save their lives at the very least. Like, at the economic fallout that's already going on now, you're so stuck on $1, you won't even allow a person to live. And I think that's a very interesting conversation that could be had. But I do wonder about the fact that politics has taken a drastic swing, where we just heard a few days ago, you got a president that's pushing for the idea of possibly injecting disinfectants in order to fix yourself. So I don't know where the swing of focus is in terms of well-being of people, but I think if the well-being of people is still important, I think there's a way to push that conversation forward where people can be looked out for at the expense of landlords' pockets. Because how can you explain you being so stuck on $1 that you allowed several people to die in your custody, essentially? because there's nowhere else to go. It's not like there's a housing market really up and booming at this point. There's no other place to go. There's no one else that's willing to deal with those types of, all those types of relationships that could lead to, oh, well, I could live somewhere else. That comes at the peril of somebody having to risk their life in order to talk to you, in order to convene with you, double check and see your profile is right, and then give you another housing of the sort. So there is no second option of housing for people. So if people are kicked out, that means people can possibly be on their deathbed within a matter of weeks. So I think if you push the well-being aspect of this and make people have to put their reputation at stake because they allowed people to die for the sake of $1, that might be the thing that really changes people's mind in terms of the economic fallout, and really push for the idea of changing how we think about housing for a while, and make landlords take a loss at the expense of allowing people to live. And then we figure out once everybody's on the same page. But again, it's really just a matter of if people are all on the same page on well-being. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think what Fabian is saying is right. And it's just like, oh, like people not paying rent might lead to the collapse of the real estate industry. It's almost like renters have political power or something. It's just crazy. But yeah, like if, you know, millions of people can't pay rent, like the burden of that should not fall on the tenants. It's up to, like, you know, the governor and the legislator to like look at the situation and figure out the best way to go forward. And like, you know, we think that we have the best way to go forward, so hopefully they listen to us. You know?
All right, great. Oh, sorry, Sia, did you want to jump in? Okay, great. Yeah, so we're about to ask our final question because, you know, Jen and I are really sick of talking. So we want to hear from you. So if you are on the chat and you have questions, please put them in now. You can just ask them on the chat, or you can do the Q&A box, whatever works for you. Yeah, and just anything you want us to ask. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all of the questions you all ask, but we might have to pick and choose. So if we don't get to your question, I'm really sorry. But start asking them now so that we'll have them when we're done with our last question. So without further ado, my final question. All right, so this is really open to everyone. Do you see a rent strike and kind of the organizing that's been happening, the organizing that's going to happen? Do you see all of this as having the potential to both to permanently reshape both New York state politics and potentially even national politics? And if you do see that potential, what is the mechanism?
Yes, I mean, that's why we're doing it. So the mechanism really is like the real estate market, and it a little bit answers the question that is in the chat from Joey. So as the real estate market becomes less valuable and as the speculative value of buildings declines, it's a lot easier to think about how we could cap things either through a subsidized acquisition loan fund, through eminent domain, or through things like third-party transfer, where the city is allowed to tax foreclose on buildings to bring them into public ownership. So I think the sort of collapse of the real estate market that is maybe heightened by something like a rent strike or a cancel rent demand does create an opening for a massive public investment, because that's the only option. If nobody can pay rent or nobody will pay rent, and the real estate market is sort of crumbling and crumbling, somebody has to step in, and it's a lot more likely that it's just like strength hand of the public sector to step in and like make a different type of like intervention than a profit motivated actor might make. So that's the push. The push is like cancel rent today, but social housing tomorrow, right? We really do see this as a path. The cancel rent demand and is a path that unlocks a potential for like a vast expansion of the public sector when it comes to housing.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone else, Fabian, Marcela, or Sumathy, does anyone else want to dive in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to understand that a lot of this real estate crisis was really created by the real estate and the speculation and the wanting to convert affordable units into market rate, changing the laws, and it was a lot of greed, right? And so we're in a situation where we really need to have a more in-depth conversation about getting our elected officials more civically engaged and understanding what the issues are, and making sure that they're being held accountable. But also understanding that folks are coming together and really building a collective power, and the changes that are possible. The real estate industry is still reeling from the hit of the passage of the historic rent laws. They've been working to try and undo them. And now there's this issue with folks not able to pay rent. And so there is a really great opportunity to change the conversation and change the narrative and really capitalize on an opportunity to make long-lasting changes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. You all said such great things. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer, but maybe we should open it up to the Q&A. I know that we had one question come through earlier, which is a question for any of the four of you. What have been some of the organizing breakthroughs so far, or organizing highs and lows?
I think for me, it's been like just a shift in the way people are thinking. Like, you know, tenant organizing before this was obviously not the easiest thing in the world to get people to come together and with their neighbors and take collective action. And so I've just been seeing like people reaching out and being like, can you send me a list of all the numbers you have in my building? Because I want to talk to everybody, try and get people to go on rent strike. Like I've just seen such a development of more organizers and more leaders in our tenant movement. And I think like to partly answer the question before, it's like this is gonna help us win so much more after this. So many people are being politicized by the current crisis. And yeah, I'm excited to like see where that energy goes.
Yeah, I would totally second that. Like the amount of people who want to organize is higher than pretty much ever before. It's really so exciting. But beyond that, like in addition to that, we've already won the first ever closure of housing court in New York State's history. So I think that I'm worried, right? Like the closer we get to May 1st, the more scared people are. Governor Cuomo is slashing our state budget, and that's very scary. And I just, I think it's incumbent on us as organizers to urge people to not get scared and not to back down, because it is getting harder. There was I think at the beginning, a lot of energy and sort of adrenaline around the moment, and not excitement, that's the wrong word, but hope. And I think the longer that it goes on, the more uncertain, the longer we're having to live with this uncertainty, the harder it gets. But it's just important to remember that it's a marathon, not a sprint. We weren't going to overturn the real estate market in just 2 weeks. So things happen quickly, but they also happen slowly over time, and we have to be able to sustain ourselves for a long haul.
I was wondering, Marcela and Sia, but also obviously Sumathy and Fabian too, could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned, Marcela, you mentioned the rent laws that were won last year. Could you talk a little bit about, the victory, the really incredible victory you had last year, and kind of, first of all, how you did it, and kind of what lessons, we can learn from that, both for organizing this rent strike, but also as socialists more broadly. I mean, I can easily say the Eco-Socialist Working Group really does look to the victories of housing justice for all as a model for how we can win.
Yeah, I think that I think we did learn a lot from the losses, and we're getting better and better each time at figuring out how to win. It was really the realization that our so-called allies were not really our friends, right? And we're really beholden to special interests. And so part of it was getting involved in the electioneering that's needed to get the right people in office that are going to push and to help push your agenda forward. And I think that we saw a lot of really great elected officials step up and actually run a platform and run their campaign on this housing issue. I think it was also very important to change the narrative. For a long time, the rent laws were just considered an issue for city tenants, and really being able to use those organizing skills that we've prepared leaders for to really start reaching across the state and start working collectively and cultivating that power to then make the changes that we were able to see. It was really amazing, and it was a very it was an effort by a large group of folks, and that really included the support of the elected officials who were going in there and pushing for these laws.
Thank you. We have actually a few other questions that popped up in the chat. So Amber asks, I've been trying to organize my building, and one concern that's come up is that we don't have a lease. It is likely that we'll be evicted after the eviction. Is it likely that we'll be evicted after the eviction moratorium is over? What legal support is out there? Also, will this rent strike impact folks' credit scores? Is it recommended to just try to negotiate the rent lower to address these concerns?
On that same note, I'd like to just add my own question to this is, if you don't pay for May and an eviction, will that show up on your record? Will you have trouble finding housing in the future?
Yeah, yes. Like if your landlord ends up taking you to court because you didn't pay rent and we don't win that eviction case, whether you get evicted or not because you put your money away, that eviction, that can show up on your record, right? The tenant blacklist is technically illegal, but it's totally unenforceable. And so the reality is if your landlord takes you to court because you didn't pay rent for a couple months, that can show up on your record. It can't affect your credit score unless you get a money judgment, unless you lose the eviction case, and then they transfer it to a creditor to try and collect the rent. But more often than not, that actually doesn't happen. More often than not, you give up the apartment and you move, and they're not going to pursue you for that money, although they can technically, but they usually don't. In a traditional rent strike, people actually are withholding rent in the ability that they have to pay. So you have money to pay, and you're putting that money aside. So to strengthen your negotiating hand when and if your landlord takes you to court. So you go to court and you're like, hey, I have all this money, but the landlord's not making these repairs. And then you pay, and the judge negotiates some lower amount based on the repairs. So, but that's not the scenario that we're in right now. Most people don't have the ability to pay, right? People have lost their ability to pay. So whether you're on a rent strike or not, those same risks apply. So you can jump in and get with us, or you can be out there on your own. Either way, you're in the same situation. But that's what we mean when we say that a rent strike is a risky tactic. It's not going to be easy, right? If it were easy, more people would do it more regularly. I think that we should be very aware and hopefully, at least in my experience, politicized, right, by the fact that our landlords have such control over our future lives. And that's an unjust system that we're trying to push back against. But it's so unjust, but it's so embedded that if you're looking to say I'm going on a rent strike. It's going to be fun. Like, that is not what the truth is. Like, it's the only option, but it's not a good option.
So some of the organizing highs and lows, it really is great to talk to people and see them feel empowered by their knowledge and want to take action, and then see them also be able to kind of like share their skills with their neighbors or a family relative or a friend who's having a housing issue. It really is about building leadership and leadership skills, and those are skills that can transcend into various things that they want to get behind, and you know, understanding also that right, housing and the lack of repairs or the conditions in your apartment could be part of the cause of health issues. And so how do you begin to advocate and make those situations better?
Well, it looks like we have one last question, which from Charlie. Have any media outlets covered Don't Pay May Day rent strike?
I'm like beating reporters off with a stick. I actually have in front of me right now, this is us in the New York Times this morning. It's really cool. So these are like illustrations of people on rent strike. This is Jose, he's an NYC DSA member. And this is Guadalupe, who is a Woodside on the Move member in the New York Times, the paper of record, the gray lady. And then there was a great story in Intercept. I'll put it in the chat if I can find it. That it would be great for folks to promote and share about this rent strike moment. And just because we've gotten some coverage doesn't mean we don't need more. We, you know, the more we get, the better. So if you want to help with media, you can reach out to any of the people on this call. And I also want to put in a plug for a town hall that we are doing on Wednesday night with Marcela's campaign and folks in Sunset Park to talk about tenants' rights and how to get involved in the Campaign May movement. So we're just going to keep talking to people in as many ways as we possibly can.
Yeah. If you want to drop any other links in the chat of how people can get plugged in, we welcome all of you to plug away.
So we're running out of time, but Marcela, I wanted to ask you, for any of our viewers, any of our listeners, how can they get involved in your campaign? I'm right now dropping into the chat links where they can sign up to volunteer and donate, but are there any events coming up, any way that they can get involved and help you win in Sunset Park?
Yeah, they can go to the website and sign up. We're currently doing a bunch of phone banking. We're going to start phone banking every day. We do a little training before to get folks kind of ready and acclimated and somewhat warmed up. And we're going to be doing the town hall that Sia mentioned. And yeah, just visit the website and you can follow us on social media. The handles are Marcela4NY, and the website is same thing, Marcela4NY.com. So it's MARCELAFORNY.
Thank you so much, Marcela. Thank you, Fabian. Thank you, Sumathy. Thank you, Sia. Thank you all for making time to join us tonight. And
thank you, Sumathy and Fabian. Do you have anything? Do you have anything you'd like to plug? Any events coming up?
We do not at the moment. We're going to be doing another Hope Town Hall probably later in May, but folks can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. The handle is Hope Organizers or Hope_organizers, and keep up to date with what we're doing.
Great, thank you. Added to the chat. And Sia, can you just one more time repeat the info for the town hall?
It's on Marcella. I think it's on Marcella's Facebook. It's on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Everyone have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
A reminder, we are going to be hosting an additional presentation now that will be led by Idiapa and Lawrence. So if you are tuning in and would like to learn more about the Public Power Campaign, you can stay on. Thanks again, Sumathy, Sia, Fabian, and Marcela.